Leaders that master the advocacy competency advance the cause of public education through social justice and how it benefits our students and members' professional needs and rights. The predominant themes within the advocacy competency include engaging the community around issues that support student learning, interpreting and acting on social justice initiatives, investigating and reporting on national, state, and local public education policy and reforms, and participating in, as well as taking a leadership role in activities involving the political process. As with all the competencies, we've identified behaviors that correspond to a few of the themes. The examples highlighted in this module demonstrate the full range of competency progression from foundational to agenda driving, the highest level of knowledge, skill, and ability. Please be sure to refer to the NEA Leadership Competencies Guidebook and review the full set of competencies. Kim Anderson is Senior Director for Advocacy and Outreach at NEA Headquarters. In her previous roles, she served as an attorney working on civil rights issues, as well as a Capitol Hill staffer. She was drawn to advocacy early on in her life through a personal concern for social justice, and she continues to advocate for equal opportunity, social justice, and civil rights in her role with NEA. Kim begins by talking about the importance of grassroots advocacy in today's policy climate.
I believe, after having been in the advocacy business for almost 20 years, that we are at a time, given the unfettered access that corporations have to our policymaking and political system, that for average, everyday people, grassroots power is the new currency. That is the currency with which everyday Americans have to compete with other forces that are simply more moneyed than we are. And so to the extent, and the Obama campaign frankly showed us that as well, that organized people can compete with organized money. And organized people tell a much more compelling story and have a far more impactful presence in lawmakers and decision makers' lives, because they're real people that have stories, whether it be healthcare or minimum wage or education or immigration. These are real people who have stories to tell about why they need lawmakers or decision makers to do something.
Kim provides us with a simple but effective model, 5 P's and a T, to understand the fundamentals of advocacy.
Having the experience of identifying a policy or a practice or a circumstance that needs change, specifically around students in this case. So what can we do to better the lives of students and their success or their potential for success? Identifying what needs to change, identifying who the decision makers are that make that decision or could have an impact on the policy or practice, and then mapping a course of what you need to do to get there, to make that change. It's the fundamental part of advocacy theory. And I use the 5 P's and a T. You have to understand what policy you're going after. You have to understand the process that it will take to get there. You have to understand the politics involved, because in any decision, it always involves politics, both internal to the association as well as external. You've got to understand the press environment and how does the public perceive this particular circumstance. You have to have partners. Can't do it alone. Very rarely in this day and age can you make change without partners. And you also have to understand what tools you have available to you.
Next, Kim goes into 2 advocacy examples. One demonstrates advocacy at the organizational level with affiliates working closely with the national office to achieve a policy win for educators. The second example involves members' grassroots advocacy.
One of the most memorable advocacy campaigns I was involved in was a campaign here that we affectionately referred to as the Education Jobs Campaign. We were experiencing, it was in 2009, late 2009, so right after the financial meltdown in the fall of 2008, President Obama's election, which was cause for jubilation among many, certainly here it was. President Obama passed a stimulus package which helped stabilize the economy, certainly helped education budgets. It was the largest increase in education spending from the federal level ever in history. However, as we got later into 2009, that money began to run out, and school districts who had been triply hit by the foreclosure crisis and the inability to collect property taxes, which is a significant chunk of education spending, and state budget cuts, it was like a triple whammy all at once. So you had federal money that was about to disappear, state budgets being cut, and local property taxes and that tax base being diminished. So what happened ultimately was a lot of layoffs of educators and a lot of programmatic cuts that really devastated kids. Lack of after-school programs, shifting to 4-day school weeks, absolutely the wrong direction for kids and what students actually needed. Same thing was happening with higher ed. Faculty were being let go, programs were being cut, etc. So we decided to make a run at getting more federal money directed to states to help stabilize state budgets and school districts' budgets in particular, so that we could save the programs that kids needed the most, to help reduce ballooning class sizes. We were hearing stories of teachers with 45 and 50 kids in their classrooms, and like I said, going to 4-day school weeks at a time when kids should be spending more time on task. School districts really legitimately did not have enough money to keep the lights on 5 days a week, and we even heard of stories of school districts going bankrupt and our members working for free because they didn't want kids to suffer. So we went to the federal government and said, you need to give us some more money because this is what's right for kids and right for our members.
She describes the difficulty of rallying support for the bill, but fortunately, NEA was able to leverage the help of a few key champions and partners.
As a former Hill staffer, I thought immediately to the political difficulty that we would face because the stimulus bill in and of itself was very difficult to pass. There were a tremendous amount of forces trying to bring the number down originally, and so many members of Congress thought, okay, we've done that. Obama got his one shot, we're done, no more money to states. So there was a very heavy lift, a persuasion lift, on the left and the right, in terms of political aisle, to convince folks that this was really needed. So I immediately thought, who can our champions be? We really need some champions who I use football analogies, who can be our blockers so that we can run behind and to support them and give them what they needed. And fortunately at that time, Chairman David Obey, who was chairman of the Appropriations Committee, absolute lion in terms of tactician, progressive champion, longtime friend of the association, was absolutely insistent that this was the right thing to do. And so we had a champion that was obviously in a powerful political position, which worked to our benefit. And then we went to Secretary Duncan and said, we think this is the wrong direction, will you help us? And he absolutely good champions, one in the House and one at the Department of Ed and the executive branch. And then we had to figure out how to navigate the Senate, which is a little more difficult and a little slower. And then I started thinking about process. And that was really complicated because every shot at the apple we had to get a provision slipped in a bill somewhere, it seemed like we were showing up just 30 seconds too late. And the opportunity would, the Senate Appropriations Committee reported a bill out of committee without this provision in it. And the White House weighed in at the 11th hour, too late, after Senator Inouye and the Republican side of the aisle had already cut their deal. So we missed that opportunity, and so the press reported it as being dead on arrival and we'd never get it in. And then we went to the Senate floor and we tried to get it in there, and we weren't successful there, and we were successful in the House. So it was just a matter of being really persistent at every single turn and every single part of the process. And as I was thinking about this campaign, I tracked there were 18 critical moments, process moments, where we had a shot at getting this either in or out, good or bad, up or down. And in the end, the tally was 10 good moments to 8. So it really was, for every positive step we seemed to take, forward, we'd get knocked backwards. And that, when you get press articles that, sort of say to the inside the Beltway crowd, this is dead, this isn't going anywhere, naturally it takes a huge, heavy lift to breathe back momentum into that campaign.
She shared some of what she called the sausage making of the legislative process. But through persistence and the widespread involvement of many talented advocates at the national level, as well as at the affiliate level, NEA worked with leaders and members of the Maine Education Association, and the end was in sight.
The end of the story was exhilarating. It was August, July and August. It was right around the time we were at the RA, actually, and we had some critical votes. We were getting calls from the Hill right and left from our friends. Are you going to score this vote? How important is this to you? We made it very clear of the importance, and won several really key votes. And the key turning point was when we were able to work with the two senators from Maine, Senators Snowe and Collins, who announced that they would support us. Because remember, in the Senate, we're in this weird position now where you got to get 60 votes to move anything. It's not a 50-vote majority rules anymore because of process limitations. So getting to 60 was difficult then, and we absolutely needed bipartisan support. And we were the association that was able to deliver those votes out of Maine, and it was really exhilarating to know that once we got over the procedural hurdle in the Senate, we knew it was going to go.
In this next and last example of advocacy in action, Kim ends where we began, emphasizing the importance of grassroots power of educators in the advocacy process.
Several years ago, when the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was up for reauthorization, which is IDEA, it's the federal law that governs special education, our members told us that one of their principal concerns about how the law was being implemented was the tremendous amount of paperwork that it created for them, and without additional funding for additional clerical support or technological tools to help with that. And so we didn't quite know who to go to on the Hill to be a champion of that. And lo and behold, I was watching a congressional hearing about the subject and looked over at the dais on the Republican side of the aisle to a very conservative member from Florida who started talking about how he had been in his district talking to constituents and specifically educators about what was going on in schools. And this paperwork issue surfaced for him and his constituents. And he took up the cause, and it was done from a very grassroots perspective. It was about educators sitting with him, I think it was in a school gymnasium, talking with him and showing him the stacks of papers that they had to fill out and showing him all the various forms that were duplications, and for a real live example. And from that anecdote, just that one experience of being impacted by just listening to several educators and watching the dysfunction that had been created, he took that up as his single issue in the IDEA reauthorization bill. And he was, to excuse the phrase, he was like a dog with a bone. I mean, he just wouldn't let it go because he was so impacted by that one story from Florida teachers in his district that couldn't manage all of the paperwork, and it was detracting from their ability to serve kids. The first thing I thought of was there are no permanent friends and no permanent enemies in the advocacy game, and you can find friends when you least expect them. This is a man who we didn't agree with on many issues at all. Ideologically, we're very far apart on most policy issues. However, this one, we agreed. And so it teaches you a lesson to always be open-minded about finding common ground. Sometimes when you don't think there might be any, you always have to have an open mind and always have to remember the cardinal rule of lobbying and of advocacy. No permanent friends, no permanent enemies.
As you can see, the experiences Kim has spoken about reflects a variety of themes and associated behaviors at different levels. This demonstrates how competencies do not need to be a linear progression. Now that you've learned about the advocacy competency, its meaning, and the behaviors associated with it, how can you add process to advocacy so that it is more systematic and thorough? How can you galvanize the grassroots in your advocacy efforts? These are the types of things to think about in growing as an advocacy leader within NEA. If NEA were to interview you, what example would you give?